Picture this. You wake up at dawn in medieval Iceland, and instead of checking your phone for notifications, you're about to witness something that would make modern lawyers weep with envy. No paperwork mountains, no billable hours, no suits that cost more than a house. Just pure, spoken law that could settle disputes faster than you can say, "Objection sustained." Welcome to the world of the Althing, where justice came with a side of honour and a handshake that actually meant something. But before we dive into this fascinating world of medieval justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling me what you find most interesting about these ancient legal systems. Your engagement helps me bring more of these historical deep dives to life, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next in this series. The year is 1250, and Iceland is about to show the world how real justice works. No fancy courthouses, no judges in powdered wigs, just the raw power of community law that kept an entire island civilization running smoother than a Swiss watch. This isn't some primitive system either. We're talking about legal procedures so sophisticated they'd make Harvard law students take notes. And the best part? It all happened outdoors, under the open sky, where everyone could see justice being served. The Althing wasn't just a court, it was the beating heart of Icelandic society. Every summer, for 2 weeks, the entire country would converge on Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the very ground seemed to split apart like nature itself was making room for human justice. This wasn't some stuffy legal proceeding hidden behind closed doors. This was democracy in action, medieval style, where your reputation was your currency and your word was your bond. Now, imagine being a farmer named Bjorn, waking up in his tent as the first rays of sunlight pierce through the morning mist. Today isn't just any day. Today he's going to court. But this isn't about some traffic violation or property tax dispute. This is about grazing rights. And in a land where sheep and cattle meant the difference between prosperity and starvation, these cases carried weight that could crush a man's entire future. Bjorn's been preparing for this moment all winter, gathering witnesses, memorizing the exact words he needs to speak. Because in this world, one wrong phrase could sink your case faster than a leaky boat in a North Atlantic storm. The beauty of this system was its simplicity. No lawyers charging by the hour, no endless appeals, no legal jargon that required a dictionary to understand. Just people speaking truth to power, backed by centuries of tradition and the unshakable belief that words, when spoken correctly and witnessed properly, held more power than any sword or shield. The Althing had been running for over 3 centuries by 1250, and it had developed into something that would make modern democratic institutions jealous. A system where every free man had a voice, and every dispute had a path to resolution. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just about settling arguments between neighbours. The Althing was where Iceland's entire legal code lived and breathed. Every year, the lawspeaker, imagine a human library combined with a Supreme Court justice, would recite 1/3 of the entire law from memory. That's right, no law books, no legal databases, just pure human memory, keeping an entire civilization's rules intact. The guy had to memorize laws covering everything from murder to sheep theft. And if he forgot something important, well, that could literally change how justice worked for the entire country. The morning of our farmer's court date would start long before sunrise. The law speaker would climb up to the law rock, a natural stone platform that served as Iceland's version of the Supreme Court steps, and begin his daily recitation. His voice would carry across the valley, reaching hundreds of tents where families huddled around their morning fires, listening to the laws that governed their lives. This wasn't background noise. People actually paid attention because knowing the law could mean the difference between winning and losing their case, between honour and shame, between prosperity and ruin. Meanwhile, Bjorn and his kinsmen would be making their final preparations. In this society, you didn't go to court alone. Family ties weren't just about blood, they were about survival. Your kinsman wasn't just moral support, he was your legal advisor, your character witness, and your backup plan all rolled into one. Together, they'd review their strategy one more time, making sure every detail was perfect, every witness was ready, and every word they planned to speak followed the ancient formulas that gave their arguments legal weight. The genius of the Althing system was that it recognized something modern courts often forget. Justice isn't just about being right. It's about being heard, understood, and respected. When Bjorn walked toward the court area, he wasn't just another case number in a system designed to process disputes like a factory. He was a member of the community, carrying his family's honor, his ancestors' reputation, and his descendants' future on his shoulders. The stakes were personal, immediate, and absolutely real. The court itself would be buzzing with activity that made a modern stock exchange look calm. Witnesses comparing stories, neighbors catching up on gossip, merchants making deals, and families arranging marriages, all while the serious business of justice unfolded in the center of it all. This was community life at its most intense, where every decision echoed through generations and every word carried consequences that could reshape entire family lines. What made this system truly remarkable was how it balanced individual rights with community needs. Sure, Bjorn had his grazing dispute, but the way it was handled would affect how similar cases were decided for years to come. Every judgment became part of the living, breathing legal tradition that kept Iceland functioning without a king, without a standing army, and without the kind of central authority that most medieval societies couldn't imagine living without. The preparation phase was crucial because once you entered the formal court proceedings, there were no do-overs, no appeals to higher courts, and no lawyers to blame if things went wrong. You had one shot to present your case according to the ancient formulas, with the right witnesses saying the right words at the right time. Miss a step, forget a crucial detail, or stumble over the traditional phrases, and your case could collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But this wasn't just about memorizing legal formulas. The really smart participants understood that the Althing was as much about politics and relationships as it was about law. While the formal proceedings followed strict rules, the informal negotiations happening in the tents between sessions could make or break a case. A well-timed gift, a clever marriage proposal, or a skillfully negotiated settlement could turn bitter enemies into allies before the final judgment was announced. The social dynamics were absolutely fascinating. Picture hundreds of families camping together for 2 weeks, with old grudges simmering, new alliances forming, and everyone keeping score of who owed what to whom. It was like a medieval version of social media, except instead of posting updates, people were literally staking their reputations on public declarations that would be remembered for generations. As Bjorn made his way through the crowds toward the quarter court where his case would be heard, he'd be calculating not just his legal strategy, but his social one too. Who were the judges likely to be sympathetic to his cause? Which families had connections to his opponents? What marriages, business deals, or old favors might influence how his case was decided? This wasn't just about grazing rights anymore. It was about navigating a complex web of relationships that determined how power flowed through Icelandic society. The quarter court system was brilliantly designed to prevent any single region or family from dominating the others. Iceland was divided into 4 quarters, and each had its own court with its own judges drawn from the local population. This meant that justice wasn't just some distant authority imposing decisions from above. It was neighbors, judging neighbors, people who understood the local conditions, the family histories, and the practical consequences of their decisions. But here's what made the whole system work. Everyone involved understood that they might be on the other side of a similar dispute someday. Today's judge could be tomorrow's defendant, and today's witness might need your testimony next year. This created a powerful incentive for fairness, because burning bridges in such a small, interconnected society was basically social suicide. The oath ring that played such a crucial role in the proceedings wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a sacred object that connected every legal decision to the deepest beliefs of the community. When someone placed their hand on that ring and spoke their testimony, they weren't just making a statement. They were invoking the power of the gods, the authority of their ancestors, and the judgment of their descendants. Lying under such circumstances wasn't just perjury, it was spiritual suicide. The weight of that oath ring wasn't something you could fake or brush off like a modern court appearance. When Bjorn's turn came to approach that sacred circle of metal, his hands would be shaking, not from fear of the court, but from the crushing responsibility of speaking truth in front of his entire community. One false word, one exaggerated claim, and he wouldn't just lose his case, he'd lose his soul's standing with the gods themselves. Talk about pressure that makes modern witness stands look like casual conversation. The formal proceedings followed a rhythm that was part legal procedure, part religious ceremony, and part community theatre. Each side had to present their case in a specific order that couldn't be changed or skipped. First came the identification, who you were, where you came from, which family line gave you the right to speak. Then came the facts, what happened, when it happened, and where it took place. Finally came the legal foundation, which specific law had been broken and why the court should care about your particular grievance. Mess up that order, and you might as well pack up your tent and head home. The judges weren't there to help you figure out your case or give you hints about what to say next. They were there to determine whether you'd followed the ancient formulas correctly and whether your witnesses could back up your claims with rock-solid testimony. It was like performing surgery with a room full of doctors watching your every move, except instead of a patient's life hanging in the balance, it was your family's honour and financial future. But here's where the Althing system showed its true genius, the testimony phase. Witnesses weren't just people who happened to see something. They were carefully chosen community members whose word carried different weights depending on their reputation, their relationship to the parties involved, and their knowledge of the specific laws being invoked. A neighbour who'd been watching the disputed grazing land for 20 years carried more credibility than a distant relative who'd only heard stories secondhand. The most powerful testimony came from what they called oath-worthy men, individuals whose reputation for honesty was so unshakable that their word alone could swing a case. These weren't necessarily the richest or most powerful members of society. They were the ones who'd proven over decades that their word was their bond. When one of these men stood up and placed his hand on the oath ring, the entire court would fall silent because everyone knew they were about to hear something that would reshape how the case was decided. Meanwhile, between the formal court sessions, the real wheeling and dealing was happening in the tent city that surrounded the official proceedings. Families would huddle in their temporary homes, plotting strategy, making offers, and floating trial balloons to see if a settlement might be possible before the final judgment came down. These weren't backroom deals or corrupt negotiations. They were legitimate attempts to find solutions that both sides could live with while still preserving everyone's honour. The role of the women in these informal negotiations was absolutely crucial, even though they couldn't speak directly in the formal court proceedings. Aunts, mothers, and sisters would work behind the scenes, using their networks of relationships to find creative solutions that the men might have missed. A marriage proposal between the right families could turn a bitter grazing dispute into a celebration that strengthened both sides. A well-timed gift, or a promise of future cooperation, could provide the face-saving compromise that let everyone walk away with their dignity intact. One particularly clever tactic involved what we might call strategic matchmaking. If two families were locked in a legal battle that threatened to spiral into a blood feud, the women would start floating the idea of a marriage between the younger generation. Suddenly, that disputed grazing land wasn't just about this year's grass. It was about creating a legacy that would benefit both families for generations to come. It was like turning a zero-sum legal battle into a positive-sum family merger, complete with its own built-in peace treaty. The go-betweens who facilitated these negotiations were masters of diplomatic language that would make modern United Nations mediators jealous. They had to communicate settlement offers without appearing to admit weakness, gauge the other side's flexibility without revealing their own bottom line, and find creative solutions that addressed everyone's core concerns without violating the strict honor codes that governed Icelandic society. It was like playing three-dimensional chess while blindfolded and riding a horse. Back in the formal proceedings, the judges faced their own complex calculations. These weren't professional arbitrators who could hide behind legal precedents and procedural technicalities. These were members of the community who would have to live with the consequences of their decisions long after the Althing ended. They knew that a judgment that was technically correct but socially disastrous could tear apart relationships that held their entire society together. The most skilled judges developed a reputation for finding what they called narrow fines, penalties that addressed the legal violation without destroying the losing party's ability to function in society. Instead of imposing crushing financial burdens or social exile, they'd craft solutions that acknowledged wrongdoing while providing a path back to respectability. It was like performing legal surgery with a scalpel instead of a battle axe, removing the diseased tissue while preserving the healthy relationships that surrounded it. The testimony phase could stretch for hours, with each witness adding layers of detail that painted an increasingly complex picture of what had actually happened. But the really experienced court watchers knew that the turning point often came from unexpected sources. Sometimes it was the quiet neighbor who'd been watching the disputed land every morning for years, noting exactly which animals grazed where and when. Other times it was the traveling merchant who could testify about similar cases he'd witnessed in other districts, providing the broader context that helped judges understand how their decision would fit into the island's overall legal framework. The most dramatic moments came when witnesses contradicted each other, not through malicious lies, but through honest differences in perception and memory. When this happened, the judges had to weigh not just the content of the testimony, but the character of the witnesses, their potential biases, and their track record for accuracy in previous cases. It was like being a detective, a psychologist, and a community leader all at the same time, sifting through conflicting accounts to find the thread of truth that would support a just decision. The formal language used in these proceedings was so specific and ritualized that even small variations could change the meaning of entire arguments. Witnesses had to speak in phrases that had been tested by centuries of legal practice, using words whose meanings had been refined through countless similar cases. It was like speaking in legal poetry, where rhythm, word choice, and traditional formulas carried as much weight as the actual facts being presented. As the day wore on and the testimony phase neared its end, you could feel the tension building in the court. Everyone knew that once the last witness spoke, the judges would retreat to deliberate, and when they returned, someone's life was going to change dramatically. The losing side wouldn't just face financial penalties. They'd carry the social weight of a public judgment that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But even in this tense atmosphere, the community aspect of the Althing never disappeared entirely. Between witness testimonies, people would catch up on news from distant parts of the island, arrange business deals for the coming year, and share information about everything from weather patterns to family celebrations. It was like the entire country was having its annual reunion, complete with all the drama, politics, and social maneuvering that comes with putting hundreds of families together in one place for 2 weeks. The judges themselves were acutely aware that their decision would become part of the living legal tradition that guided future cases. Every judgment added another layer to the complex web of precedents that helped maintain consistency across different courts and different years. They weren't just solving Bjorn's grazing dispute. They were helping to write the ongoing story of how Icelandic society understood justice, honor, and community responsibility. When the judges finally called for deliberation, the entire court held its breath like the moment before a thunderclap. These weren't career jurists who could hide behind legal textbooks or precedent databases. These were farmers, traders, and craftsmen who understood that their decision would ripple through every conversation, every business deal, and every family gathering for years to come. They carried the weight of their community's trust on their shoulders, and everyone watching knew it. The deliberation process itself was a masterpiece of controlled democracy. The judges would form a tight circle, speaking in voices low enough that the crowd couldn't hear their individual opinions, but loud enough that everyone could see the animated discussions taking place. You'd watch their faces, trying to read which way the wind was blowing, looking for tells that might hint at how your case was being decided. It was like watching a poker game where the stakes were your family's entire future. What made these deliberations truly fascinating was how they balanced legal precision with practical wisdom. Sure, the judges had to follow the ancient laws, but they also had to consider whether their decision would actually solve the underlying problem or just create new ones. A technically correct judgment that left both families seething with resentment wasn't really justice. It was just paperwork with consequences. The best judges understood that real justice required not just following the rules, but healing the community wounds that had brought people to court in the first place. The crowd dynamics during deliberation were absolutely electric. You'd see clusters of people huddled together, whispering predictions about what the judges might decide. Family members would pace nervously while their neighbors offered words of encouragement or concern. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but it was the kind of tension that comes from knowing you're witnessing something important, something that mattered to everyone present. Meanwhile, the informal negotiations would kick into overdrive. Even with the judges deliberating, there was still time for last-minute settlement offers, desperate plea bargains, and creative compromises that might save face for everyone involved. The go-betweens would dart between family groups like diplomatic messengers, carrying proposals that could turn a devastating legal defeat into a manageable social arrangement. It was like watching a medieval version of shuttle diplomacy, except instead of preventing wars between nations, they were preventing blood feuds between neighbors. The women's networks would be working overtime during these crucial moments, floating marriage proposals, trade agreements, and future cooperation deals that could soften whatever blow the judges were about to deliver. An aunt might approach the opposing family with a suggestion that their young daughter would make an excellent match for her nephew, turning today's legal adversaries into tomorrow's in-laws. It was brilliant social engineering disguised as casual conversation. When the judges finally reached their decision and prepared to announce it, the entire court would fall silent, with an intensity that made modern courtrooms look chatty. This wasn't just about one farmer's grazing rights anymore. It was about how justice worked, how community standards were enforced, and how conflicts could be resolved without tearing society apart. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would become part of their shared history. The announcement itself followed ritual patterns that had been refined over centuries. The lead judge would stand, clear his throat, and begin with the traditional phrases that signaled a formal judgment was about to be delivered. His voice would carry across the valley, reaching not just the immediate participants, but anyone within earshot who wanted to hear how justice was being served. There was no privacy, no sealed records, no confidential settlements. Everything happened in the bright light of community scrutiny. But here's where the Althing system showed its true sophistication. The judges had developed an art form around delivering judgments that acknowledged wrongdoing without destroying lives. They'd craft their words carefully, finding language that satisfied the legal requirements, while providing face-saving opportunities for the losing side. It was like performing verbal surgery, cutting out the diseased parts of the dispute while preserving the healthy relationships that surrounded it. The concept of the narrow fine was pure genius. Instead of imposing crushing penalties that would bankrupt families or destroy reputations beyond repair, skilled judges would identify the smallest possible consequences that still address the legal violation. Maybe Bjorn would have to pay compensation for the disputed grazing, but the amount would be carefully calculated to acknowledge the harm without making it impossible for him to maintain his standing in the community. The psychology behind these narrow fines was remarkable. They allowed the winning side to feel vindicated without humiliating their opponents, and they gave the losing side a clear path to making things right without admitting to being terrible people. It was like finding the perfect balance between justice and mercy, between upholding the law and preserving the social fabric that held everything together. When the judgment was finally announced, you could feel the collective exhale from hundreds of people who'd been holding their breath. But the real test came in how both sides received the decision. The winners had to show grace and restraint, avoiding any behavior that might rub salt in their opponent's wounds. The losers had to demonstrate acceptance and dignity, proving they could take their medicine without becoming bitter enemies of the entire system. The immediate aftermath of a judgment was like watching a carefully choreographed dance of social reconciliation. Family members from both sides would approach each other with formal words of acknowledgement, neither gloating nor sulking, but simply accepting that justice had been served according to the ancient ways. It was community healing in real time, with everyone playing their part to ensure that today's legal dispute didn't become tomorrow's blood feud. The payment of fines or compensation often happened right there on the spot, with coins or goods changing hands in full view of the assembled community. This wasn't just about settling debts, it was about demonstrating that the legal system actually worked, that judgments weren't just empty words, but real consequences that people took seriously. When Bjorn counted out the silver pieces that represented his penalty, everyone watching understood that the law had teeth. But the most beautiful part of the whole process was what happened next. After the formal judgment, after the compensation was paid, after all the legal requirements were satisfied, something magical would occur. The tent city would come alive with celebration, not because one side had won and the other had lost, but because the community had successfully resolved a conflict without violence, without permanent division, and without destroying the relationships that made their society function. The evening feast that traditionally followed major court decisions was like a giant community potluck, where former legal adversaries would find themselves sharing meals and stories. Bjorn and his opponent might end up sitting at the same table, passing the ale horn and discussing next year's weather patterns like the morning's legal battle had been nothing more than a friendly disagreement between neighbours. It was forgiveness and reconciliation served with roasted mutton and barley bread. The social pressure to participate in these reconciliation rituals was enormous but subtle. Nobody forced the losing party to join the celebration, but everyone understood that staying away would signal bitterness and resentment that could poison future relationships. Smart families knew that gracious acceptance of defeat often earned more respect than bitter victory, and they'd make sure to show up with smiles and contributions to the communal feast. The storytellers would already be working the day's events into the oral tradition that preserved Iceland's legal and social history. Tonight's judgment would become tomorrow's precedent, but it would also become next year's cautionary tale, teaching future generations about the importance of following proper procedures, respecting community standards, and accepting the consequences of their actions with dignity. The children running between the tents would absorb these lessons without even realizing it, watching how adults handled conflict and resolution, seeing firsthand how their society balanced individual rights with community needs. They were getting a masterclass in citizenship, learning that justice wasn't something imposed from above, but something created through the collective wisdom and goodwill of people who had to live together. As the evening wore on and the ale flowed freely. The formal boundaries between winners and losers would blur into the general celebration of community life. People would share news from their home districts, arrange marriages for their children, plan trading expeditions for the coming season, and generally conduct the business of keeping Icelandic society functioning. The Althing wasn't just a court. It was the social glue that held an entire civilization together. The overnight conversations in the family tents would be filled with analysis of the day's proceedings, dissecting every argument, every witness testimony, and every judicial decision, like modern sports fans analysing a championship game. But unlike modern legal discussions, these conversations were practical preparation for future cases, future relationships, and future opportunities to either seek justice or provide it for others. Young men would listen to their fathers and uncles explaining the subtleties of legal strategy, learning which arguments worked and which ones backfired, which witnesses carried the most credibility, and which judges were known for their wisdom or their unpredictability. It was like a masterclass in practical law, taught by people who'd lived through decades of similar disputes and learned the hard way what worked and what didn't. The women's conversations would focus on the social and political implications of the day's decisions, mapping out how the judgment would affect marriage prospects, trading relationships, and alliance possibilities for years to come. They understood that legal victories were meaningless if they came at the cost of social isolation, and they'd already be planning strategies to repair any relationships that might have been damaged by the day's proceedings. The genius of these late-night strategy sessions wasn't just about understanding what had happened, it was about preparing for what came next. Because in a society where legal disputes were as common as summer storms, today's witness might be tomorrow's defendant, and today's judge might need your testimony next year. The smart families treated every Althing like a chess match that lasted for generations, where every move affected not just the current game, but all the games that would follow. The most experienced participants understood that the real education happened in these informal conversations between the tents. A grizzled farmer who'd been attending Althings for 40 years could teach you more about practical legal strategy in one evening than you'd learn from a dozen formal proceedings. They'd share stories about cases that seemed hopeless until the right witness stepped forward, or seemingly certain victories that crumbled because someone forgot a crucial procedural detail. These storytelling sessions served multiple purposes beyond just entertainment. They were how legal knowledge got passed down from generation to generation, how precedents were remembered and applied, and how the community's shared understanding of justice evolved over time. When an old-timer told a story about a similar grazing dispute from 20 years ago, he wasn't just reminiscing, he was teaching everyone present about how the law worked in practice. The younger men would hang on every word, memorizing not just the facts of each case, but the subtle details that made the difference between success and failure. They'd learn about the importance of choosing the right witnesses, the art of presenting evidence in the most compelling order, and the delicate balance between aggressive advocacy and respectful deference to the court's authority. It was like a medieval law school, except the professors were your neighbours, and the case studies were real disputes that had shaped their community's history. But the most valuable lessons weren't about legal technicalities. They were about human nature. The veterans would explain how to read a judge's facial expressions, how to tell when an opponent was bluffing, and how to recognise when a witness was stretching the truth without quite lying. They'd share insights about which families held grudges for generations and which ones were quick to forgive, which districts were known for producing honest witnesses, and which ones had reputations for creative interpretations of the facts. The psychology of the Althing extended far beyond the formal court proceedings into these nighttime gatherings where relationships were built, maintained, and sometimes quietly repaired. A shared drink between former adversaries could do more to prevent future conflicts than any legal judgment. And the wise participants understood that investing in these personal connections was just as important as mastering the formal procedures. The children who stayed up late enough to listen to these conversations were getting an education in citizenship that no modern school could replicate. They were learning that justice wasn't an abstract concept administered by distant authorities, but a living, breathing process that required the active participation of everyone in the community. They saw firsthand how disputes could be resolved through careful listening, respectful argument, and genuine commitment to finding solutions that everyone could live with. The morning after a major judgment would bring its own unique rituals and challenges. Families would pack up their tents with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion, having participated in something larger than themselves, while also dealing with the very personal consequences of legal decisions. The winning side would try to maintain their dignity while enjoying their victory, while the losing side would focus on demonstrating that they could accept defeat gracefully and move forward without bitterness. The journey home from the Althing was often when the real impact of the proceedings would sink in. Families would have days of travel to discuss what had happened, what it meant for their future, and how they wanted to handle similar situations if they arose again. These conversations were crucial for processing the emotional and practical implications of the legal decisions, helping everyone understand their place in the community's ongoing story. The ripple effects of each Althing would spread across Iceland like waves from a stone thrown in a pond. News of major judgments would travel from district to district, carried by merchants, travellers, and family members returning home. Each retelling would add new layers of interpretation and analysis, helping the entire island understand how their legal system was evolving and what standards were being established for future cases. Local assemblies throughout Iceland would spend months discussing the precedents established at the Althing, debating how those decisions should influence their own legal proceedings. The system was designed to maintain consistency across the island while allowing for regional variations that reflected local conditions and customs. It was like having a constitution that could adapt and evolve without losing its core principles. The marriage negotiations that began during the Althing would continue for months afterward, as families explored whether strategic alliances could prevent future legal conflicts while strengthening their social and economic positions. These weren't cold, calculated arrangements, but genuine attempts to build relationships that would benefit everyone involved. A well-planned marriage could turn potential enemies into allies, disputed land into shared resources, and legal adversaries into extended family members. The economic impact of the Althing extended far beyond the immediate costs of travel and accommodation. The 2 weeks of intensive social interaction would generate business deals, trading agreements, and cooperative arrangements that would drive Iceland's economy for the entire year. Farmers would arrange to share equipment and labour, merchants would establish new trading routes, and craftsmen would find markets for their specialised skills. The information exchange that happened at the Althing was just as valuable as the formal legal proceedings. Families from different parts of the island would share knowledge about everything from agricultural techniques to weather patterns, creating a network of communication that helped the entire country adapt to changing conditions. A farmer from the north might learn about a new crop variety from someone in the south, while a coastal family might share insights about fishing techniques with inland neighbours. The religious aspects of the Althing were deeply woven into every aspect of the proceedings, from the sacred oath ring that sealed testimonies to the traditional prayers that opened each day's sessions. This wasn't just ceremonial window dressing, it was a fundamental recognition that legal decisions carried spiritual as well as practical consequences. When someone placed their hand on that oath ring, they were invoking powers greater than human authority to witness and judge their words. The seasonal timing of the Althing was no accident. Summer was when travel was easiest, when food was most plentiful, and when the long days provided enough light for extended proceedings. But it was also when the psychological impact would be strongest, as the bright sunlight and warm weather created an atmosphere of openness and community that made reconciliation easier and bitter feuds harder to maintain. The environmental setting of Thingvellir added its own powerful symbolism to the proceedings. The dramatic rift valley, where the ground itself seemed split apart, served as a perfect metaphor for the conflicts that brought people to court. but it was also a place of stark beauty and natural grandeur that reminded everyone present of forces larger than their immediate disputes. Standing in that landscape, surrounded by evidence of geological upheavals that dwarfed human conflicts, it was easier to maintain perspective about the relative importance of grazing rights and property boundaries. The acoustic properties of the valley meant that voices carried farther than they would in other settings, allowing the law speakers' recitations and the court's proceedings to reach larger audiences. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic recognition that justice belonged to the entire community, not just the immediate participants in any particular case. When the law speaker's voice echoed off the valley walls, it was like the land itself was participating in the preservation and transmission of legal knowledge. The weather could dramatically affect the mood and outcomes of the proceedings. A week of sunshine and gentle breezes would create an atmosphere conducive to reconciliation and compromise, while cold rain and harsh winds might make everyone more irritable and less willing to find common ground. Experienced participants learned to factor weather patterns into their legal strategies, timing their most important arguments for days when conditions would be most favorable. The logistics of feeding, housing, and managing several thousand people for 2 weeks required organizational skills that would impress modern event planners. Families had to coordinate not just their own needs, but their contributions to the communal aspects of the gathering. Everyone was expected to contribute something, whether food, labor, or specialized skills, to keep the entire assembly functioning smoothly. The security arrangements were largely based on mutual self-interest and community pressure rather than formal enforcement mechanisms. Everyone understood that disrupting the Althing would damage their own interests as much as anyone else's, since they all depended on the institution for resolving their disputes and maintaining social order. The few troublemakers who couldn't control themselves would find their behavior becoming a community-wide topic of discussion, creating social consequences that were often more effective than any formal punishment. The cultural exchange that happened at the Althing was just as important as the legal and economic activities. Families from different regions would share stories, songs, and traditions, helping to maintain Iceland's cultural unity despite the geographical isolation of many communities. The gathering served as a kind of cultural parliament where new ideas could be introduced, debated, and either adopted or rejected by the community as a whole. The technological innovations that emerged from these gatherings were often solutions to practical problems that multiple families were facing. A clever farmer might demonstrate a new tool design. A skilled craftsman might share techniques for improving traditional products. Or a trader might introduce materials or methods learned from foreign contacts. The concentrated expertise of the entire island created opportunities for innovation and improvement that wouldn't have existed in isolated communities. So there you have it, the Althing of medieval Iceland, where justice was served with a side of honor and community wisdom that puts our modern legal circus to shame. Picture Bjorn walking away from that valley, his case settled, his honor intact, sharing ale with the same neighbor he'd been fighting in court just hours before. No appeals court, no legal fees that could bankrupt a kingdom, no years of bitter litigation that turns families into enemies. Just 2 weeks of intense community engagement that somehow managed to solve disputes, preserve relationships, and keep an entire civilization running without kings, armies, or the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that makes modern citizens weep. The real magic wasn't in the elaborate procedures or the sacred oath rings. It was in the simple recognition that justice belongs to the people who have to live with its consequences. When your judge is your neighbor, your witness is your trading partner, and your legal opponent might become your daughter's father-in-law, suddenly everyone has a powerful incentive to find solutions that actually work for the long term. The Althing proved that spoken law, backed by community trust, and enforced through social pressure, could create a justice system more effective than anything we've managed to build with all our modern technology and professional expertise.